All right. So welcome to lesson 2 of the organic module. And this one we're going to discuss something that is most often overlooked, something that's very rarely discussed as well, and something that you've kind of been doing a little bit in lesson 1. And it's also the thing that I talk about heavily in the Proco video is contour manipulation, right? So this is one that you very rarely see, and I feel like it's a really important one because it can really help you understand more complex shapes, especially anything organic. Now, also inorganic, like hard surface things, can definitely help you here. But it's getting a better understanding of contour manipulation will also give you the power to exaggerate things, as we'll see in lesson 4, and also stylize things, which is one of the one of the most important things in concept art today. Not everything in concept art is stylized, but there's definitely a lot stylized stuff. Whether it's character design or prop design, in animation, whatever. So there's a lot of that going on. And that's something that we're going to discuss in today's lesson. So the thing I'm going to go over first is just we're going to look at the simple shapes, and then we're going to see how these simple shapes, what contours they have, and how we can then manipulate those contours. And now we're going to do that. If you jumped to this lesson, like, there's nothing for you here. You need to go through all the lessons because it's going to be an amalgamation of understanding everything, especially from shape manipulation to just understanding things in perspective. And that's why we're doing this contour manipulation so late in the course. So if you think of I'm gonna use another color. If you think of a cylinder, right, in a certain angle, doesn't really matter which one. This is sort of my default cylinder angle. The thing that we already discussed, especially in like the subtraction and addition video, is that this cylinder has a lot of different cross sections, right? Like we could imagine this cylinder being just discs stacked on top of each other, right? So disc after disc after disc. So if we indicate that, right, we're basically indicating the contour of that shape. Now, we can call it a cross section because we're going to run through this shape, but that's basically what this cylinder is made up of. And now, if we look at that in profile, the contour of the cross section of this cylinder is basically a perfect sphere. And now this is not a perfect sphere, but just bear with me, use your imagination. You're artists after all, right? So it's a perfect sphere. And this is what I call the contour manipulation, or at least what we're going to try and do. Because what we're going to do now is, instead of that being a perfect circle, what if it's a manipulated circle? And by manipulation, we can either, cut something out of it, or we can use, like, if in digital terms, we can use like a liquefy tool and change the geometry of this. So for instance, if it's something that looks a little bit more like this, right? What if this is our new cross section? How would that then translate to this cylinder? So if we think about that, we can then see, so what we're again going to do is we're going to project this in that same angle. So I'm going to try and do my best here. It's not perfect, but I'll do. And so we need to imagine that going through like all these cross sections, and where is that going to end? Right. And that's basically, and of course we need to at all times keep our perspective in mind while we're doing this. Because that's going to make this look believable and convincing, right? So it might look a little bit something like this. The edge might be a little bit more like this, but, right? So this is what that manipulated contour or cross-section would look like. Now we can do the same for a box, right? We can do exactly the same thing. So if I, for instance, have a box in perspective, this box essentially has, let's use the same colors, essentially has cross sections that run like this. Right? And if we draw through one of these, right, this is what we see. And again, so if we look at that in an orthographic view, that cross section is just a simple square. Right, so this is what makes up our simple primitives as well. If you think about a cylinder, if we think about a box, it's just very simple geometry and very simple cross sections. But now what happens if we, instead of having a simple box like this, we have something a little bit more, maybe a little bit more organic, something like this. Right. How will that again translate in perspective? Right, so that's actually the hardest part of this assignment primarily, is to figure out what your resulting shape will look like in perspective. Right, we're basically trying to almost project these cross sections in space and then convincingly portray that in the correct perspective. So now you might also say, yeah, well, Antonio, isn't that just exactly the same as addition and subtraction? And yes, to some extent it really is. The thing, however, though, is that it's sometimes harder for you to imagine what kind of simple primitive shapes are being subtracted or added to another shape. And sometimes it's a lot easier to just imagine how the contour is being manipulated. And that's why I'm teaching you this as well. Because the thing about drawing, and especially as a concept artist, figuring out complex shapes is not about using one set method. It's about being able to quickly use your tool bag and just come up with the fastest solution to solve the problem. As you've heard many concept artists say before, we are problem solvers, right? So whatever tool we need to solve the problem is the best one, right? It doesn't matter which one it is. It just the fact that we can solve it efficiently is the most important one, right? And so in the example that I use, for instance, in the Proco video as well, is that, for instance, if you look at the horns of a goat or a ram, is that it might look like a super complex shape at times, right? And even with addition and subtraction, it might be very hard to figure out what's actually going on. It bends and it twists and it curls, and on top of that, it has super complex geometry and texture. But sometimes it might be a lot easier for you to understand that this is just a cylinder that's first being manipulated as if it's being twisted, right? So as if it's just, so instead of it being just a cylinder in space like this, we're actually now manipulating that and we're bending it, right? Like this, and even bending it backwards, right? Like this, and then it not only bends, right? So instead of it being so if we look at this if we look at the cross section or the minor axis, sorry, right? If we look at the minor axis that runs through this, if you look at that minor axis in profile, it's just a straight line, right? But for the thing that I'm going to draw here, that straight line becomes a curvature like that. And not only that, we're not only just using a cylinder with the same width on top of that minor axis, we are also tapering that cylinder, right? So that cylinder gets smaller and smaller and smaller And so that's essentially what we're seeing. And so if we look at the cross-section or the contour of this cylinder, which is the manipulated cylinder, we still have this sort of cross-section. It's just a perfect circle. But then if we go to manipulate that circle, and instead of it being what I've drawn here, it becomes something more like, I'm going to think about how a horn usually looks a little bit. So, you know, it kind of looks like this and this. Right. So this is our new cross-section for this entire shape. Right. So we're not only drawing this, we're also drawing this with these contours. And so what we then need to think about is, okay, we're going to again project that in the correct perspective. Right. So we need to be aware of our perspectives or of our planes. And then we're going to do the exact same thing. But we, of course, need to be aware of where the cross sections will intersect and meet, right? And this is, of course, this isn't an easy task, right? This is something that you need to work at and you need to train in order to get more proficient at. But that's essentially what we're doing. Right. And so if I then draw the cross sections on top of this, and that's why I made you do the assignments in lesson 1 of this week, or of this module, sorry. You can sort of start beginning to understand how we can make more complex looking shapes just by thinking about simple shapes and how those simple shapes, how those contours of the simple shapes are being manipulated. Right? That's the main idea of this explanation, and it's something that I don't see a lot, and that's why I wanted to explain it to you guys. So let's think about another real life example where this is a good, like a good way to understand it. And I think one of the another good example is the one where I talk about the shape wrapping for the knight's armor. I think that's a really good one as well, because if you normally think about you know, if you were to simplify it very easily, the chest armor for a knight, you might think that we have a basic sphere, right? And then the armor sort of wraps around it. Right, so if you remember the shape wrapping, which you should, we sort of have this very simplistic idea of simple shapes wrapping around other simple shapes. Now, of course, our belly and our torso isn't a sphere, or it's not a perfect cylinder, right? So instead of this being either a cylinder or a sphere, we're kind of manipulating the contour of that simple shape, that internal simple shape a little bit, right? So instead of that cylinder looking like this, the shape for the torso and for the chest armor, when you look at it, when you analyze it, the contour doesn't just look like this. It looks a little bit like it's a little bit squished on top, but then in the middle, it kind of goes outwards and inwards a little bit, right? It pinches, and then on the bottom, it becomes a little bit rounder again, right? So this is like top, middle, and bottom. And so if we draw that, if we just draw the contours, and I'll use the same blue here, right? So if we just draw the contours in perspective, right, and this one is a lot bigger, right? And then this one at the bottom is a little bit more roundish. Something like that. If we then draw our resulting shape, this is sort of the resulting internal cylindrical shape that we have. Right? We haven't done anything yet to the internal, indication, or it's just a silhouette, right? But then on top of this is where we're wrapping around, right? So we're sort of adding and subtracting and wrapping, right? That knight's armor. Sort of, it looks like this, and then it goes inward a little bit, then it follows the cross section, and it picks up on the bottom, and then we have the back plating as well, of course, which is usually just straight down. And now this isn't the best example, of course, because I'm making this contour come straight towards us. But if we draw it from the side now, we have that squish part for the bottom, the top, I'm sorry. And then we have that manipulated intersection. Right? And let me just draw my minor axis going through this completely. We have that medium or middle contour or cross section, right? That runs like this, and then we have the bottom one like that. And now if we draw that resulting shape, of that chest plate, this might be a little bit exaggerated, but for demonstration purposes, it's okay. Right, that cylinder might look a little bit like this. And then when we wrap our shape around it, thinking of like what that knight's armor might look like, this is the back plating, and then this is that frontal plating that you see on a lot of knight's armor sometimes, right? And then we even sometimes have like this extra cone, right, attached to it. And for the back, and also to attach the leg guards to it. And now you can see how this contour line is basically affecting that shape, and how we can think about it when we're analyzing something like that, right? And you can do this for a lot of things, not only armor, anything, hard surface even, or a lot of organic stuff. Think of things like fish as well. Instead of it just thinking about, okay, instead of thinking, let's say, if we have a shark, for instance, right? Let's say instead of thinking that the head is half a sphere attached to another tapered cylinder attached to another tapered cylinder like this, right? And then instead of thinking, okay, what part is actually being subtracted or added, what if we just consider it that this cross section of that half sphere, right, that we have here. So if you look at it in profile, it looks like this. What if we just manipulate that? What if we manipulate it to resemble more the head of a shark, which is usually a little bit more flat at the bottom, or at the top, I'm sorry, right? And then, it's maybe a little bit more like this, or a little, even maybe a little bit sharper as well. So maybe a little bit more like this, right? This is better, right? So what if this becomes this, right? And then we can project that in space. And create something that resembles a little bit more the thing we're trying to draw, right? And the eyes probably go here, and then we still have a mouth like here, and of course the fins and, you know, everything that makes up a shark, right? But so we can really regard like these contour and these cross sections, this manipulation, this can really benefit us greatly. And so that's something that I really want you to practice. And so that is also what you're going to do for this lesson's assignment. All right. So I hope this was clear, and let's move on to the assignment. All right, so for your assignment for lesson 2 of this module is you're going to, again, in 3 parts. For the first part, you are going to draw 20 of each primitive, so a cylinder or a box, and you're going to draw 20 manipulated results of those primitives. So a cylinder with 20 manipulated cross sections and a box with 20 different manipulated cross sections. That's what you're going to do for part 1. Then for part 2, you're going to do a more complex alternative of that, right? So you're going to move this needs to still present a cylinder or a box, right, in its rigid form. Whereas here you can also bend, twist, you know, whatever you like to do in terms of other manipulation that needs to be visible, right? Inflate, like I do here, with also a manipulated contour. Now, again, it doesn't have to represent anything. Some of them naturally will because of, you know, just how you draw them, but they don't need to represent anything. They do, however, need to have at least 2 types of manipulation, contour manipulation being one of them, right? That's going to be for part 2. Need 20 of these, so I need 40 total of these, 20 total of these. And then lastly, for part 3, what you're going to do is you're going to look for 5 different references from something organic, right? So nothing hard surface in this case, because this is the organic module. Something organic. And so, for instance, what I have here is like the claw of a T-Rex. Right, it needs to be something existing, nothing from imagination yet, or nothing from an artist, nothing from fantasy. It needs to be something real life, right? Think of like what I said, the horns of a goat, of a ram, this from a T-Rex, a shark, whatever, right? But 5 of them, and first you're gonna draw them as you see in the reference, clearly indicating how the contour is being manipulated throughout, right? And then you're also going to draw the same reference in a different angle, because I want to see that you understand what you're looking at, right? So you're not only going to copy what you see, you're also going to rotate it and like show to us that you understand what you see in terms of how these contours are being manipulated. So you're going to do a total of 5, but it's going to be 10 total drawings, because you're going to be doing 2 drawings for each reference. Right? So that's going to be your assignment for this lesson. Again, take your time with it, have a lot of fun with it, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.